Infinifactory is immediately understandable in a way that Zack's previous games simply weren't. Under the guise of an intelligence test, training starts with the most simple example imaginable, using conveyor belts to move an item from one area to another. There's no complex manipulation involved, just a line of conveyors moving it along, like something you'd see in a genuine factory, and it helps that placing a row of blocks is also highly intuitive. From here, a variety of other tools are gradually introduced which can be used to set up more complicated construction lines. After conveyors come welders, which are a basic building block of nearly every factory, but even with just these two mechanics, a problem arises. Since blocks need to be welded together, they end up stretching over several conveyor belts as a single object. These objects can only move orthogonally, which means when an item is touching two perpendicular conveyors, it has to decide which direction to move. It can't do both. Unfortunately, the way this is resolved is by assigning north and south a higher priority than east and west. Here's an example. Notice how the object moves all the way across the final belt before being thrown over the side. Now the same thing from another direction. Even though it's the exact same setup from our perspective, the object goes overboard 2 places earlier. In isolation, this doesn't seem too bad, but during actual play, there's so many different ways that objects and conveyors can overlap, it becomes too hard to predict when the change in direction will occur. Once you become conscious of this quirk, it's hard not to be annoyed by it, especially during later stages when the products get larger or space is more constrained. In all likelihood, you'll end up running your factory a lot just to see where blocks are ending up, which may or may not qualify as trial and error, but it certainly feels like it is. For a game as complicated as Infinifactory, it's hard to tell what kind of ramifications even a simple change could have, but as far as I can see, there is a more consistent way this problem could have been handled. Objects could have favoured the direction they were already moving, until the number of conveyors going the other way outnumbered them. That would make behaviour consistent for all directions. Regardless of whether there's a better way of doing it or not, the point is, it feels sloppy compared to the crystal clear precision of the Waldos and Spacechem. Before delving further into the differences between Infinifactory and Spacechem, it's worth stressing the ways in which they're similar. Once again, new mechanics are introduced at an incredibly even pace and extend well past the point where they could have reasonably ended. Introductory stages once again harness the power of restrictions to push players in the right direction, before opening back up into full-on problem solving in the following levels, where those new mechanics are thoroughly explored. As before, time and space are clearly segmented, with depth again arising from logical interactions between established mechanics, in this case factory blocks being combined in creative ways. All of these aspects are every bit as important and well implemented as they were before, so keep those in mind as we delve into the flaws and triumphs of Infinifactory specifically. The 3D nature of Infinifactory is its defining feature compared to Zachtronics' earlier games of this style. It literally adds an extra dimension, which is often put to good use by requesting outputs that are multiple blocks tall. It's not uncommon to have several criss-crossing conveyors in a manner that wouldn't be possible in 2D space. The way moving objects will slide out from under a stack is a little counterintuitive, but this seems like a necessary contrivance since welding is one of the primary mechanics. Carefully positioning welders so that they function efficiently while not clogging up the rest of the production line is one of the most commonly recurring challenges. If stacks could be moved before welding, this would be trivially easy to accomplish. Verticality on maps themselves is quite restrained. In fact, there's often just enough height between the inputs and the output to assemble the product without having to move anything upwards. As a result, it's generally best to avoid using lifter blocks since they don't move items closer to the goal. Perhaps it would have been good to have a few more stages where the output is higher than the input to encourage more lifter use, but Zachtronics have erred on the side of caution, and it's hard to blame them. This ensures that the few instances where the challenge comes from the terrain are novel instead of tedious. There's probably no better way of presenting these complex 3D machinations than the first-person perspective, but even so, with an extra dimension comes extra setup time. While the earlier stages play out pretty smoothly, later ones can be finicky and time-consuming. Not only do you have to physically make your way around the play area, but you also need to make sure your structures are supported so they don't fall down at runtime. Just planting the blocks that make up one operation can take upwards of a minute or two. This kind of work can be tedious, but the bigger problem is the time gap it represents between conceptualizing an idea and actually seeing it come to life. Sometimes your hard work will be rewarded with a contraption that fails immediately because you overlooked a small detail. The more time sunk into the setup, the more discouraging this feels. It can also be difficult to make adjustments. In this example, I realized that I wanted to move the lasers from the left side of the input to the right. The area move tool is a lifesaver in some cases, but since it can't rotate, it wasn't helpful in this particular instance. Knowing that a mistake can be costly means it's prudent to think as far ahead as possible, which is a good skill to reward, but also stifling. You might find you spend a lot of time just staring at the screen instead of actually doing anything. Fortunately, the visuals bring their own benefits too. While it was certainly very satisfying to craft a tricky molecule in space chem, they were still ultimately more of an abstract concept than an actual product. Although the objects you're making are just crude, blocky representations of actual things, it's more exciting being tasked with building a spaceship than some arbitrary chemical. For the most part, you're making items for your alien overlords though, something the game doesn't forget to exploit narratively. On the one hand, solving a problem and seeing the solution come to life is an inherently enjoyable task. On the other hand, you sometimes have to question whether you really should be trying to solve that problem at all. It's strangely easy to rationalize the early military-focused puzzles by imagining that the Toads are actually the good guys on some galactic scale, but it's harder to remain impartial when things get personal. Tasked with creating studio apartments that happen to look exactly the same as your cell, it's impossible to remain deluded. World 6 even introduces some commercial products exploring another angle of the situation. It's easy to see the parallels to real-life moral quandaries that scientists and engineers face on a regular basis. Thankfully, none of this is heavy-handed or preachy, you're never told how to feel about it, and the majority of the story is handled with absurd humour that takes the edge off. In a strange reversal of what you might expect, the plot for the first half is relatively sparse, with the player mostly just acting as a slave, whereas the second half actually introduces a cast of characters along with more narrative context. This addresses a concern with Space Chem, where the later stages were so difficult, only a very small percentage of players would ever see how the story ended. In Infinifactory, the true ending still happens at the very end, but by the halfway point you can be pretty sure how the rest of it will turn out, and if nothing else, you've drastically improved the situation for your character. Basically, it gives players a relatively satisfying conclusion, which lessens any potential frustration for those who tap out during the second half. On the other hand, knowing that the rest of the story is more or less a formality could dampen the interest of players who press on, but the interesting shift in presentation, creating products for yourself and getting an even better idea of how they'll be utilised, more than makes up the difference. Overall, this caters to both hardcore and casual players without throwing either out the airlock, a commendable balancing act. Just like Space Chem, the events take the protagonists to several different locales, but this time around they have the benefit of being visible at all times. Much of Space Chem was spent inside reactors, which all look identical, whereas the open air or open space approach of Infinifactory leads to a refreshing change of visuals at regular intervals. Rather than try to convince you that any of these locations could really exist in some larger universe, the art just strives to present a nicely stylized workspace. Most of the visual spark comes from the impressionist skyboxes and weather effects. Environmental textures themselves are relatively simplistic and muted, which allows the bright orange factory components to stand out. Even more interestingly, the soundtrack now follows along on the journey. Whereas Space Chem had a playlist disconnected from everything else, Infinifactory's music plays on a world-by-world basis. Taken on its own, the soundtrack clearly accomplishes its goals. It simultaneously establishes ambience for each area, while also providing some soothing synths designed not to break concentration. Liberal use of reverb evokes the ideas bouncing around in your brain, while heavily accented on-beats combined with understated off-beats essentially cut the tempo in half. It's enthusiastic, but without pressure. While it may not accentuate the theme to the same degree as Space Chem, it does more to enhance your experience of actually solving problems. Tracks generally last 6+ minutes, which shows some consideration for the fact that players will be listening to them repetitively, but even so, an individual world can take well over an hour to complete, meaning even the longest ones will loop 10 times or more. As additional areas open up, this becomes less of an issue, since players are likely to take breaks from the current challenges in order to optimize some easier ones, but it remains a problem. Even though the music normally does a great job of fostering a productive mentality, the sheer repetition can occasionally cause it to circle back, becoming a distraction again. Overall, the presentation is highly commendable, but perhaps because of that, there are a few missions which coast on the novelty of their premise rather than the actual quality of the problem at hand. Unfortunately, this means the majority of the heist chapter suffers from redundancy. With teleporters limited to one block at a time, the most obvious way to solve all of these stages is to stack up an entire product's worth of materials, then push them off onto an assembly line all at once. Unfortunately, this means the majority of the heist chapter suffers from redundancy. Another offender is Meat Product 101, since it requires a good chunk of trial and error. The whale itself is made of red and white meat, which is an important factor to consider, but there's no way of telling which part is which short of chopping the whole thing up and taking note. This is tedious enough, but thinking about optimization makes this problem even less appealing. Each whale contains so much potential meat that there's two ways to approach it. Either you try to get the most out of a single one, which almost certainly means delaying the next one, or you just carve off large swaths of it using eviscerators so you can process the next one immediately. Neither of these solutions is particularly satisfying, and while this mission is the most extreme example, the problem extends to the rest of the game as well. Wastefulness runs rampant in Infinifactory, or at least it isn't punished harshly like you might expect if you played Spacechem. The first time I accidentally lost a block, I was surprised it didn't result in an instant failure, but in retrospect I can see why. Eviscerators and lasers are key gameplay elements at later stages, so a certain amount of waste is necessary. In a sense, this isn't a problem anyway, because wasting blocks will almost certainly lead to an inefficient factory, resulting in a lackluster score for that metric. That's true, but this is where Infinifactory's biggest problems come into focus. A lot of little quirks that combine to make optimization far less rewarding than it could be. Firstly, the rate that new materials appear is defined by a menu option which can be sped up or slowed down. Building a simple solution at the default rate often collapses at higher rates, which means you end up having to do major reworks or build entirely new designs with the increased speed in mind. Because of this, you might feel as though it's better to either work at the default option just to finish the objective, or crank it all the way up to max for efficiency. If you're going to solve a problem twice, it might as well be for the best score possible. Following that mentality, you can easily end up pushing yourself too hard. I know I did, and I suspect some other players fell into the same trap. The input trigger in Spacechem was a lot more elegant, allowing the rate of materials to gradually improve as a solution got better and better. Infinifactory ostensibly provides a new challenge compared to Spacechem because the fixed input rate can clog up your factory, but the reality is there's a lot of ways to circumvent this problem. You can place a blocker on inputs to stop it from spawning new ones, eviscerate unwanted materials, or use the menu to slow the rate to a crawl. With so many ways of getting around the downsides, the only real benefit that inputs provide compared to Spacechem is that they're easier to understand, useful for the early stages when players are being introduced to the basics, but detrimental for the bulk of the experience. Secondly, each level only asks for 10 outputs, making it possible to craft solutions that spit out 10 items as quickly as possible, even if it would break down afterwards. You could say that this is the difference between an Infinifactory and a Finifactory. Even though Spacechem defaulted to 40 outputs on many challenges, it's understandable why Zachtronics would want to lower the number this time around. The max simulation speed is relatively slow, since rendering a fully 3D factory with dozens of moving parts is an order of magnitude more computationally expensive. In later levels, the objects become so large that even a relatively efficient fast-forwarded factory takes a long time to complete a single product. Still, watching your factory do its job is a reward, not a punishment, and the number didn't have to be the same for all levels. Earlier stages could have easily required 20 or even 30 outputs, while the later stages remained at 10 so as not to waste too much time. It's hard to imagine many complaints from players that they have to watch their factories a few seconds longer when it's one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game. Thirdly, there's an unfortunate quirk where falling blocks delay the ones behind them, again a consequence of items only being able to move orthogonally one tile at a time. This means, at the max input rate, it's often better to deal with inputs in bulk rather than neatly one by one. On more simplistic stages, well-optimized solutions can be built just by slapping down 10 pushers and triggering them all at once. There's nothing particularly clever or interesting about this. In fact, creating the more obvious, slower solution is sometimes more difficult and engaging. On more complicated stages with multiple inputs, this quirk causes a different problem. Inputs end up drifting away from each other, since some are getting blocked as they leave the starting point while others aren't. Maybe there's an elegant way to resolve this, but if there is, I haven't found it. Fourthly, a certain configuration of blocks can be used to create so-called giant rotating arms, an emergent mechanic which has big consequences for movement. Since rotations happen in a single cycle, an enormous rotating arm can move an object far more quickly than normal. This massively overcomplicates what should be the simple, logistical aspect of moving something from point A to point B. The fact that the community categorized their solutions as either giant rotating arms or non-giant rotating arms says it all. To be fair to Zachtronics, they engaged in a dialogue about this while the game was still in early access, asking whether it should be removed or preserved. The conclusion was that, like any unintended mechanic, players could choose to ignore it on a case-by-case basis, which is true, but the problem is that you'll always be compared against those results on the histogram. Lastly, histograms themselves are too polluted to be useful. This time around, players are allowed to revisit earlier puzzles with blocks unlocked later in the campaign. It's interesting to tackle those levels again with an expanded toolset, but it also means you aren't necessarily competing on a level playing field the first time through. Even disregarding the use of giant rotating arms, pushers and rotators can be incredibly useful for crafting efficient solutions to early puzzles, but they're only unlocked on Worlds 2 and 3. Worse still, it's clear from some of the early graphs that a large portion of the player base never tried running their solutions at a higher input rate. Notice how, on the first tutorial, the vast majority of scores fall into the 50+ cycle range, even though the score can easily be brought into the 40s just by increasing the input rate. This is the first thing you should try after finishing any puzzle. In some cases it dramatically improves your score without any additional effort. The game itself never encourages you to try this though. In fact, very little attention is called to the speed setting at all. In other words, it's certain that a large amount of entries on the histograms show cycle scores which could be greatly improved just by running the factory again at a higher input rate. The impact of this issue probably lessens on later levels, which only the more dedicated players will reach, but it's still impossible to tell where the true average lies. With different input rates, different tools unlocked, finite, infinite and rotating arm solutions all combined onto one sheet, you have no way of knowing how well you did compared to other players who used similar settings. Giving each and every different combination its own graph isn't a viable solution. It would clutter the UI, and the player base most likely isn't large enough to support so much fracturing. That said, it seems as though Zachtronics perhaps undervalued how important histograms are to player motivation and could have taken more steps to mitigate these issues. An ambitious solution would have been to secretly run an unrendered simulation in the background which tests whether the factory can also survive at a higher rate, but a more realistic compromise would have been to just add a button to the completion menu which bumps up the speed and reruns the factory. At the very least, some kind of prompt to highlight this feature would have gone a long way. While we're hovering near the topic, Infinifactory also highlights a side effect of relying on histograms to provide goals for the player. To be clear, what I'm about to say doesn't only apply to this game, but it is best represented here. There are two major tricks you can use to drastically reduce the number of blocks for any given factory. First of all, if an object is n blocks long, then you only need to place a new conveyor belt every n spaces to keep it moving. Since platforms don't count towards the block score, this can even be accomplished if the conveyors are off the ground. Keep in mind, using this technique has no negative effect on cycles. It essentially reduces the block count for free. Secondly, if you are willing to take a hit on cycles, almost every single conveyor from the finished product to the output zone can be safely deleted. Newly constructed items will push the others to the end automatically. You only need 1 or 2 conveyors to position them correctly. Neither of these techniques present a problem with the game. In fact, they're fun little optimizations to discover. The problem is, judging by the graphs, most of the player base never did figure these out. Basically, you can beat the average block count on any stage just by employing these two optimizations. I appreciate that the graph is displaying objective information, but there's something deeply unsatisfying about this outcome nonetheless. I suppose this shows the value of providing players with some more specific achievements to work towards. Infinifactory actually does have some, but they're tied to the Steam overlay rather than being visible in-game, which is slightly less than ideal. For the sake of future-proofing, it's much wiser to assume that any digital platform will implode tomorrow. Anyway, while optimization is less rewarding compared to SpaceChem, there have been improvements in other areas which make up some of the deficit. The overall structure is much more friendly than before. Each zone is unlocked linearly, but the challenges within those zones are often non-linear, at least for the most part. This means that the first mission in each zone can still act as a tutorial for later ones, but players are unlikely to get stuck just because they can't complete one specific task. In SpaceChem, the biggest of these hurdles were the boss fights, which seemed unnecessary for the type of game it was. Thankfully, Infinifactory removes bosses almost entirely, the one exception being especially surprising and entertaining since it happens in isolation. For the most part, it simply relies on its increasing difficulty and some short scripted sequences to keep the player invested in making progress. It works and makes the experience much more smooth and less frustrating. Another great refinement is the addition of multiple save slots for each challenge. I promise I'll stop bringing this up now. Technically, you could do this in SpaceChem by manually managing your save directory, but of course it's much better to have this built into the user interface. This is one of those small tweaks which ends up making a huge improvement to the overall experience. You're free to try a totally different approach to each stage without having to interfere with your previous design. You can even easily copy from one slot to another for experimentation. I found I enjoyed leaving my first solution in the top save slot, completing the level again later, and then comparing the two. Your early attempts can look downright embarrassing compared to your later ones, but this just proves how much your mastery over the game has grown. It adds a whole new layer of enjoyment to the experience. Lastly, there's the returning Sandbox mode, which is a huge step up just thanks to Infinifactory's block-based nature. While SpaceChem might have been Turing complete, that doesn't mean much to us humans without the ability to output things we can actually understand. Meanwhile, for Infinifactory, the community creations range from digital counters, calculators and cellular automata, all the way up to one insanely impressive recreation of TIS 100 in Infinifactory. If you ask me, this one amazing user creation is enough to justify the entire game's existence by itself. The potential this sandbox offers is firmly established, but even here a couple of additions could have expanded it further. It's easy to envision an LED block which players could set the colour of before runtime, useless for solving puzzles, but a lot of potential in the sandbox. It's hard to know where to draw the line on these matters though. There's always one more thing to add or one more tweak to make. At least as it is now, the focus is still on building factories. It's hard to begrudge the developers for not turning the sandbox into something else entirely. Infinifactory sits in a strange place. For a casual audience, it's undoubtedly one of the best entry points into the Zachtronics catalogue. It seems that the goal was to create something more welcoming and easily understandable than SpaceChem. Judging it by those criteria, it's a massive success. The sandbox also allows for some utterly insane creations by the most dedicated players, so clearly the mechanics have a lot of merit on a deeper level as well. It's the middle ground that concerns me, and many other players. The quality of life improvements are welcome, the shift to 3D is novel, the presentation is greatly improved, but optimization isn't as enjoyable. Large puzzles can be excessively time-consuming, and histograms are muddled. It's not a clear step forward, but it's a worthy step sideways that opens the genre up to more players while exploring the pros and cons of an extra dimension. In the end, I for one welcome our amphibian overlords. In the next video we'll be facing our greatest challenge yet, getting a printer to work, so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.